Welcome back everybody, time for another one then, and today it's the turn of the AlphaTauri AT02, the second iteration of their car since the rebranding from Toro Rosso, a car that last year, as in the AT01, had some decent results, decent performance, won a race in the hands of Pierre Gasly, didn't it? So it's got high expectations, and Franz Tost, the team principal, certainly has high expectations for this version, saying that he wants it to be consistently at the forefront, at the leading edge of the midfield. That is no small task, but is it something that it's up to? Let's take a little look at some of these smaller details, the finer details that we can see, and see what we can take from it. The first thing is to say, this is a digital render of the car, as so many of the teams these days do. They release their cars in digital render form. You have to take that with something of a pinch of salt, because there is nothing stopping them releasing an image of anything they want. They can put details on there that are completely a million miles away from reality. They can hold things back, they can hide things, they can mislead other teams, and they do those kind of things. We've already seen some teams, notably McLaren, manipulate the photographs that they release to hide certain areas, like the diffuser on the car. That's an area of so much interest this year given the regulations around that end of the car. So what can we take from this one? Well, the AlphaTauri AT02 at the rear end, it's interesting in that it's pretty much the same. And the reason that's interesting is they had the opportunity, being a customer team of Red Bull, where they use an entire Red Bull rear end, gearbox, rear suspension. They even share, of course, the Honda power unit. Now, under the current regulations of Formula One, they had the opportunity, in the same way that Aston Martin can and are doing the same thing with Mercedes, to upgrade their rear end that they buy from their parent company to the version of the rear end that that parent company was using last year. So what I mean by that is AlphaTauri, who last year were using a year-old Red Bull set of technologies at the rear end, without spending any development tokens, could, if they chose to, upgrade those to the system that Red Bull were using on their prime car last year, if that makes sense. They could take what would have been a 2-year-old system and upgrade it to now just a 1-year-old system under the regulations without costing them any of their valuable token spend. What's interesting about this is that AlphaTauri haven't chosen to do that. They have retained the same rear end that they used on the car last year, which now is a 2-year-old set of technologies. The reason they've done that is a couple of things. First of all, they were very happy with the performance of the rear end of that car, or of the car in general, last year, and they see consistency as perhaps being a greater benefit than employing a new set of technologies that will come with it a whole new journey of discovery and learning, something that takes time to figure out in a season when development is going to be so limited, so restricted, both by the budget cap, but also by this balance that every team has to find between developing the 2021 car and splitting resource off into the 2022 car that of course requires so much resource and development and effort going into that, because of the opportunities that will come when that whole new version of Formula One comes into play in 2022. So taking something that's a known quantity adds some value and some opportunity to the team. That's exactly what they've decided to do. We're sticking with the same tyres we had last year. That also means that the knowledge of how the rear end works with those tyres also will carry over to this year. So they've retained a huge chunk of what's going on at the rear end of the car. There are some detailed changes by regulation, as we know, around the edge of the floor, around the diffuser, and around the rear of the brake ducts. I'll get into some of those at the moment. But what is new on this car, and where they have decided to spend their 2 allowable development tokens, is at the front end. So AlphaTauri have chosen to spend their tokens on a new nose cone and front suspension elements that go along with that. Very difficult to see exactly what they've done from the images that they've released. As I said, digital renders only, but I think what we can notice is that they have taken some elements on the underside of the nose that are slightly different to before. A much more sculpted underside of the nose here, which slims in to almost like a shark fin on the underside of the nose cone, all helping to divert airflow that spills around the edge of the nose into that really critical central section of the floor where it can be then worked by barge boards going off towards the rear of the car to the under section, the underneath of the floor, a valuable area for generating performance from the diffuser that's actually been trimmed back by the regulation changes further towards the rear. They've still got the same inlets. You can see here an inlet here for the duct that exits at the top of the nose cone there. S-duct, as many people call it. What this does is it takes some of the dirty air, this sort of slow moving, spiraling, dirty air that spills off the top of the nose here. It collects some of that up in a knacker style duct that draws a lot of that messy flow in, and then it simply takes it through an S-shaped duct on the inside of the nose and ejects it at the top of the chassis. Now that's simply a sort of perhaps the most efficient or the least non-efficient way to get rid of some of that horrible, messy, inefficient airflow around there from an area around here that really needs to keep that controlled, high speed, controlled flow through to those critical areas. So that's an old technique, but one they've chosen to carry over onto a brand new nose design. The front wing actually looks pretty much to me like the same front wing that they finished the 2020 season with, so not going to go into too much detail on that. When you see the car from top down, you can get a better indication of some of the changes they've made. At the front end, you can see they've still retained that wide nose cone that bucks the trend that many of the other teams have followed, going down a much narrower route there. That's just an element, that's something they know. That's a detail that they know and understand how the flow paths work around these kind of structures, and therefore they've chosen to retain it rather than just copy everybody else, which to me in 2021 makes some sense. Making radical changes to any car this year is a massive risk because you don't necessarily hit the ground running. You spend time trying to learn and understand how your car operates. And in a season where we've only got 3 days of testing before we go racing for real, that doesn't seem to be the way to go. So I like the fact they haven't just followed everybody else. Particularly, they haven't followed their parent team, Red Bull. They've got their own ways of thinking, their own design philosophy. And as I said in an earlier video with the Alfa Romeo car, that should be celebrated in my opinion. You can see from the top, you can see the detail changes to the cape underneath. You can just see it protruding. That's part of that reprofiling of the underside of this brand new nose cone, and how the cape now links into what seems to be almost a slimmed in vertical fin running along the underside of that nose. As I said before, using these profiles, these surfaces to scoop the airflow that comes off the front of the wing and the nose tip, the wing pillars that are mounted on the front there, gathering that up, directing it, controlling it towards those critical areas at the front of the floor, the leading edge of the floor. Really critical, more so than ever before, in driving flow underneath towards the diffuser, where it's sped up through that small gap at the front of the floor between the racetrack and the floor of the car itself. To explain that very briefly, I thought I should say this because I've mentioned it in so many videos, but I haven't explained exactly what I mean. Airflow, when we squeeze it through a gap or a fluid, a bit like when you squeeze the end of a hose pipe, the same amount of water is coming through the hose, but if you squeeze the end of a hose pipe to a very thin, shallow opening, the water that's coming out there speeds up, doesn't it? It sprays out at much higher velocity. Exactly the same thing happens with airflow underneath the car. If we create a small gap between the front of the floor and the racetrack, or on the Red Bull I talked about it with the front wing being tipped down to such a degree because of their high rake, we create that what we call ground effect, where the small gap between the front of the floor and the racetrack is so small that the airflow running through there has no choice but to speed up. And what happens to a fluid, airflow or water or any fluid, is that when you speed up the velocity of that fluid, the pressure drops. And what we know about that is when we drop the pressure of a fluid underneath an area of bodywork, in this case underneath the car, that low pressure zone creates a pulling force because the ambient or high pressure zone above it wants to force its way down to the lower pressure zone. That's what all of this work around the front end is to try and do, generate as much high speed airflow going underneath that floor. Because once it goes to that high speed zone, that low pressure zone at the front of the floor, the leading edge where it's squeezed through that small gap, it then begins to expand as the car rises up towards the rear of the car. Then the diffuser is an even bigger expansion chamber. As the airflow expands, it returns to its more ambient pressure, And what that does is help to draw more and more airflow through those small gaps and through the diffuser at the same time. All of that generating enormous chunks of the car's overall downforce capability. And in 2021, with the changes around the rear of the floor, you can see here how the rear of the floor tapers in. It used to be parallel to the centre line of the car, but in 2021 we've had to now taper this in with a view to minimising some of the effect of that diffuser and lowering the downforce capability of the car. Now, the way that AlphaTauri, if we jump to the rear end, have dealt with this, at least on these renders, is slightly different to some of the other teams at this stage, or certainly slightly different to the images that some of the other teams have released. What AlphaTauri have shown here is that they haven't necessarily just gone with a straight line. They've taken a cutout out of that. Now, that cutout loses you surface area. Now, the more surface area you have, in theory, the more downforce you're able to generate from that surface area. But one of the things the regulations have lost on this car, or on these 2021 cars, is the ability to put slots, fully enclosed holes, which we saw on last year's cars all down the sides or the outboard edges of the floor to generate and to seal the edges of that floor, which then seal off that high flowing airflow underneath the diffuser, maximising the effect of that diffuser and generating more downforce. The slots and holes and flick ups and what we used to call tyre squirt slots around here were all designed to protect the diffuser from messy turbulent air coming off the rear tyres. We've lost all of that capability. So what AlphaTauri have looked to do here is to create a little slot with a turned up flick up within this new allowed area. They've sacrificed some surface area but employed a tiny little device to try and generate a vortex coming off the back of this now turned up edge, this turned up surface, which might help to start to recover some of that sealing capability that the regulations have sought to minimise. I expect lots of other teams will already be playing around with ideas like this, but just haven't yet released them in the early part of, or the early images that they're showing of their car. When we start to see cars on track, particularly at the Bahrain pre-season test, I would expect more work around this kind of area. Lots of work around barge boards, because the loss that we've had in this zone has to now be recovered somewhere. So the barge boards all can form part of that. The leading edge of the floor can seek to generate its own vortices that perhaps it wasn't employing last year to help impact or maximise the impact that the diffuser can have on the downforce potential of the car. So some interesting details, at least, that have been shown on the renders. As I say, I would expect some of that to change, both with AlphaTauri and with other cars by the time we see them for real. The rear end is actually, from what I can see, pretty much identical. So as I said before, they've kept the same rear end as before. The bodywork has changed profile slightly, and if we look at a side view, you'll get a better indication of what I'm talking about there. You can see some of the sculpting around the rear of the bodywork is definitely different to last year. Slimmed in at the rear on the underside of this little overhang here. I've talked about this before, but that helps to generate a really fast flowing path of airflow through this channel and over the top of the diffuser. You can start to see a little bit more clearly on this render what I'm talking about with that little turned up area of the floor. But look, the resculpting here comes off the back of Honda delivering them a brand new, an all new power unit for 2021. The same unit they've delivered, or they are delivering to Red Bull, that brings so much promise, so many hopes with it, both for Red Bull but also for these guys. If they can get a benefit from that and build on the strong car that they had in 2020 with a driver pairing that's really quite promising. Pierre Gasly, we know all sorts about him and how strong he is, but Yuki Tsunoda, the young guy with so much promise coming in from Formula 2, people have high hopes for him. And if he can fit into that AlphaTauri or Red Bull program seamlessly and work alongside Pierre, I think they could have a really decent chance of mixing it in a really tight midfield. The difference between doing very well and falling towards the back of that will be almost nothing, but details like this could mean they're in a strong position.